If I was to open up this weekend with a question that asks, what is the most powerful force in the world? I think pretty quickly, if not in the first few answers, the word love would emerge as a powerful force. And maybe for some of you, it wouldn't emerge immediately, or maybe that's just the optimist in me that I would assume that it would be pretty high on the list. But nevertheless, it's fascinating to me when we think about love, how we both intuitively and intimately know and understand it as a powerful force. It is also intrinsically woven into our being. But also interesting to me is that love, or at least how we define it or how we think of it, it commonly shows up in a biased and selfish and often conditional way. Even with how we think about love and how love is marketed to us, it's marketed a particular way. There's also a heavy leaning when we think about love in a romanticized direction. You can just Google anything about love. When you mention certain things about love, it seems like this romanticized view of it is like the first thing that comes to our mind. I'm thinking about movies that I've seen over the years related to love. You just put in a quick Google search and movies like Love Jones would come up. That's one of my favorites. Maybe I'm dating myself a little bit. The Notebook is another one. Beauty and the Beast, A Star is Born, Up. There's just several movies that would show up. Or maybe when we think about songs, think about classic songs like Let's Stay Together by Al Green, or A Vision of Love by Mariah Carey. What about Perfect by Ed Sheeran, or This Love by Taylor Swift? There are just several love songs that we can think of. And then even how we think about love as a sacrifice is often romanticized in our mind as well. I'm thinking about The Loving Story, which is the story of Mildred and Richard Loving, who lived in the state of Virginia, and there was a documentary about how it was against the law for black people and white people to be married. And so they were in an interracial relationship. In 1958 is when they got married, and they were arrested for this. And so when we think about those sorts of stories, yes, it was a sacrifice, but it ended up well. And even those things, again, we tend to think about in a romantic way. I'm even thinking about my former NFL colleague by the name of Pat Tillman. Pat Tillman, who played for Arizona, he had a very thriving NFL career, but after September 11th, he decided to turn in his football cleats and uniform and get the uniform of the United States Army. And he became an Army Ranger because he believed so much in the freedom of our country and defending the freedoms that we have. Even when we talk about Pat and his sacrifice, and it was a great sacrifice, we tend to think about even that tragedy in a very romanticized way. I'm not suggesting that thinking of love in a romanticized way is bad. It's not bad at all. As a matter of fact, that is an aspect of love. But to only think about it in those terms, we understand, is incomplete. But the reason why love tends to lean in this romanticized way in our minds and how we communicate it is because we only want to love a certain way, if the truth is told. Or we only want to love a certain people under certain conditions. And when those conditions are not met, or the circumstances are just not that favorable, the chances of us expressing love in an unconditional way is significantly lessened. It's because the human condition is prone to look inward first and think about self first. And this is why love in its fullness, beyond the romanticized view of love, love in its fullness and its completeness is very, very difficult to express and to live out, because selfishness has to be consistently overridden in order for unconditional love to be expressed. That means we have to look beyond ourselves at times. We have to look beyond how we feel, and we have to think beyond that. This is why Jesus spent so much time talking about love. And he went on to summarize what he said, to basically say, hey, by the way, if you forget any of the things that I've said, if you forget any of the things that I've done, let me just boil it down to you like this. Love God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and then love one another. So if we think about that, that is a vertical aspect of love in terms of loving God. And then there's a horizontal aspect of loving, which is loving one another, which is a picture of the cross. Jesus gives us this command, and he talks about this over and over and over again. This is the thread from the beginning of the scriptures all the way through to the end, because God understands that the moment you cut me off in traffic, God understands that the moment that you eat the last cookie that I was waiting for and looking for and saving for, or you drink the drink that I was saving I've never had these issues. I'm just saying, just maybe somebody else, maybe somebody else. Or the moment you call me out of my name, my initial response is maybe not what God would have for it to be, because my human nature, I don't know about you. I know I'm the pastor. I know I have the microphone. I know I have a higher standard that is set for me. But I'm just saying, I know for me, my tendency is to retaliate in the same energy that was given to me. And it's because our life and our culture and as a result of sin, as a result of sin entering into the world, which really caused a separation between God and man, it conditioned us to have a certain viewpoint, orientation, or expression of love that is deeply slanted towards self. So Jesus' opening discourse that we find in the Gospel of Matthew is known as the Sermon on the Mount. It begins in Matthew 5, but it is the Sermon on the Mount. And in this Sermon on the Mount, right immediately, Jesus begins to challenge our disposition, begins to challenge our thinking, begins to challenge how our human nature tends to respond to one another. And so if you have a Bible, I'd love for you to meet me in chapter number 5 of the Gospel of Matthew. And we'll just highlight a few verses of this discourse known as the Sermon on the Mount. We won't leave you hanging. We'll have words on the screen if you don't have a Bible with you. Here we go. It says, "You have heard that it was said," this is Jesus talking, "love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven, for he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward will you have? Don't even tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what are you doing out of the ordinary? Don't even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." This weekend, we continue this series that we've been in called We, and just a simple subject for this message, we love. Now, needless to say, after reading what we just read, this is not how we really want to roll, if we're being completely honest. Now, we'll get back to that in just a second, but I just want to give you a little bit of context and background for what we just read. This passage, as I mentioned, is known as the Sermon on the Mount, so it's pretty long. It goes through a few chapters. And as part of this Sermon on the Mount, this is really known as a kingdom manifesto. So I don't know if you're really familiar with the term manifesto, but manifesto means it's like a public declaration of policy, of aims, of motives, and or viewpoints. In essence, this is Jesus giving everyone an orientation of what it means to be a part of God's kingdom. And although it was an orientation that he was giving, it is really a disorientation because what he's saying in a lot of instances is opposite of how they have been engaging in the world. And Jesus is saying, ultimately, this is the way we are to live in the world. This is what we're striving towards. We should also understand that the primary audience here that Jesus is speaking to, they already understand some aspect of God's kingdom, or they are interested in learning what it means to be a part of God's kingdom. So these are people who kind of already know a little bit of what is going on. Now, the structure of the Sermon on the Mount, it opens with these things called Beatitudes. And the Beatitudes are kingdom blessings or attributes where Jesus would literally go down the list and say, blessed are those who are persecuted, or blessed are those who are poor in spirit. So these are the kinds of attributes that are reflected in God's kingdom. But then he flips it, and he then goes down all of these contrasting statements where he says, you have heard it said, but I say. And he goes through a list of things like murder and adultery and divorce and oaths and giving and worrying and judging others. And so in essence, the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus saying, I think y'all got a few things twisted. Just a few of them, and I just want to straighten it out for you so you understand what it means to align with God in his kingdom. And one of the things that he highlights and spends a lot of time talking about is love. And that's where we're going to part today. And there's really just two perspectives that I want us to unpack just really quickly, because I think these are the perspectives that Jesus is unpacking for us, and they'll be in question form. So if you're taking notes, here we go. The first one is, well, what does culture, both then and now, say about love? Well, in verse 43, Jesus said, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And I think the response to that would be kind of like, duh, right? Like, I'm gonna love the people that, I'm cool with. Like, if you're an enemy, like, you're not getting any love. But then in verse 46 through 47, Jesus talks about how we have this tendency to just show our people love, and that seemingly makes sense to all of us. And we understand what that's like in our culture right now. If you agree with me, or if we have similar likes, or we got similar points of connection. And this is a big one right here. If you don't do anything that I don't like, or things that I don't agree with, or things that I don't think is problematic, then we're probably going to be cool. But if not, then I don't know if I can fool with you, and you might just get canceled, unfollowed, whatever the case may be. And here's the thing. Unfortunately, often the people who say that they are Christian, worse offenders. And the reason for this is because there's some thinking that there needs to be some sort of defending of morality. And what ends up happening is morality is then weaponized. And then we have justice under the guise of a conservative or a liberal agenda, and it's not unconditional at all, because it's strongly tied to being loyal to a specific agenda. So it's not really about love; it's about loyalty to an ideology that we deem as righteous. So anyone not in line with this agenda is a threat. And what happens with threats? Threats must be avoided or they must be eliminated. So when Jesus uses this word hate, it's a Greek word, meseo, and it's an interesting word because it means to detest, and it also means to pursue with hatred, persecution, basically. And hasn't it become socially acceptable to persecute? Hasn't it become socially acceptable to hunt people down who don't agree with us? Hasn't it become socially acceptable to shame people who think differently than us, or whose viewpoint that we think is problematic? I think some of the best examples of this, and I wouldn't advise spending any time doing this, but if you look in the comment section of anything related to electronic media, a story has been written, or there's Instagram or Facebook, I mean, the comments is like a cesspool of craziness. I mean, just the most mean and vile things that are being communicated. Not in a, hey, I lovingly disagree with you, but in a just like, you need to know how you are the filth of the earth. There's an entire industry that is built upon tearing down. And it is this kind of thing that is discipling our culture and giving them their cues on how to engage with one another. Recently, I was in Houston. No, not Houston. I was in Dallas, and I heard this pastor just talking to a room of pastors. We were, doing some different training, and he talked about how he chose to defend a friend of his who was a pastor, and there were just all of these just crazy things that were being said that just were not true, and he knew that his friend wouldn't defend himself, and so he just, and it was a very, very, very just kind of shrewd way that he defended his friend, and really what all it was just calling people to think about another perspective. But he talked about how he learned in that process when he decided to defend his friend. He learned about this entire group of people whose main job it is to shame and get pastors fired. And so they have a process where they would literally get together. They would meet up and they would come up with their strategies, and they would try to figure out like how that they could just bombard the social media page. They could just put out these narratives and all of these different things. And I'm sitting in my seat thinking like, wow, like, man, who are these people? And it was like when I had this thought, it's like, yeah, and they're Christian. And I was like, whoa, wait. He said, yes, they believe that they are doing God's work by helping to dismiss those who are not carrying the moral authority of forward in the manner in which they should. And I thought to myself, like, this is crazy. But this is pretty standard practice in the world that we live in. Christian or non-Christian, Jesus or non-Jesus following. And this is what Jesus is saying, like, well, what's the difference? And here's the other thing that I want us to understand. Our culture regularly demonizes disagreement and difference. You can only have my support and my love on my terms. You know what that's called? Manipulation. That's what that's called. It's not love. So then the question becomes, is that the true essence of love? I think we know what the answer to that is. So the first question here is, what does the culture say about love? And Jesus unpacks this. But then the second question juxtaposes the first, which is, well, what does Jesus say, or what is Jesus saying about love? Well, when we pick it up in verse 44, Jesus just hits us with the statement that we really don't want to deal with. And he says, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Jesus, I was with you until you said that. Because the human keep it 100 response is, nah, bro, that ain't how it's going down. I'm not really feeling that. Because that's the last thing in the world we want to do, is show love to someone we don't like, or love to someone who's crossed us, attacked us, or hurt us. But you know what's interesting about that? What's interesting about that to me is, don't we love a good redemption story? Like, don't we love those stories where, man, like people were enemies and then they became friends, and then they joined forces and it was great, man. We love the fact that Rocky and Apollo Creed were enemies and they fought each other, and then they became friends, and then Apollo died, and then Rocky's going to defend his death. We love that. We love how in Toy Story that Woody and Buzz Lightyear was mad at Andy. Well, actually it was Woody who was mad at Andy. But they're toys, and they're like, no, I'm the best toy. Like, no, I'm the best toy. And then they became friends, and then it's like the world is great. We love those stories until it's us. We want to view those stories. We want to read those stories. We want to take those stories. We want to go to the movies and see those stories. We don't want to be in those stories. That's not what we're trying to do, because that reality is hard. And we want our enemies, or our so-called enemies, to get what they deserve. I remember like growing up, and somebody would do something, and then something would happen. I'd be like, that's what you get. Lord, we live for the that's what you get. Like that's what we waiting on right there. And that's what we want to have. But listen, Jesus said, like, what's the difference if you do what everybody else does? And then he mentions tax collectors and Gentiles. The reason why is because this is a predominantly Jewish audience, and they did not get down with tax collectors, and they didn't get down with Gentiles. Nobody liked tax collectors because they stole from people. They would come and say, hey, you owe this amount of tax that was higher than what it really was, because they can take the difference and put it in their pocket. So they were basically getting over on people, and nobody liked them. And then Gentiles, that was just anybody that wasn't Jewish. And so, if you were Jewish, you were considered to be God's people, and so everybody else was just beneath. And so it's interesting that Jesus mentions these two groups, the most hated of the groups. And Jesus is saying, no, there's no reflection of transformation or distinction if you are not operating differently than the people around you. And this is why in John 13, 34, 35, Jesus said, I'm remixing this thing. I'm giving you a new commandment. And here's the summation of the new commandment, which I think we have up on the screen. John 13, 34 through 35. Love one another. And Jesus said, as I have loved you, okay, because you haven't been deserving of God's love in this way, but love one another as I have loved you. By this, in terms of how you love one another, that's how people gonna know you're a disciple of Jesus. Jesus like, you can't be bringing my name down out here like this. This is how they will know. And this is why love is mentioned as the first fruit of God's Spirit at work in us. It is the first distinctive mark, love. Not doctrine, not rituals, not knowledge. None of those things. Those things were given to direct us, not distinguish or divide us. I should also make note here that when as I'm talking about love in this way, and as the scriptures are directing us to love in this way, this does not mean that we make ourselves doormats for people to walk over us. Because if we look at the life of Jesus, we can see Jesus regularly checking people. This is what he did. It doesn't mean that we just lay down and we take things. No, it means that we speak truth to power when necessary. We defend those who can't defend themselves, and we stand up and we push back darkness. I have a shirt that says prayer and action. It takes both. And what it means is that we need to see each other's humanity, and we fight for others, and we pray for change at the same time. And we ask God to help us to love people who least expect it and least deserve it. Because that's hard. We can't consistently do that in our own power. Maybe a few times, but consistently in our own power, it's just not going to work. Let me see if I can land the plane for us like this. I think the final question that I want to just lay before us is this. Why is Jesus saying this about love? Or what difference does it really make in the end? I think it's a good question. And I think the answer is both simple and complicated at the same time. As I began to reflect upon this question, I began to think about how lately I've been creating art. I've been painting. Judah, can you do me a favor, Judah? Can you grab that painting for me right there? Just grab that painting. And I just want to show you guys just some of the art that I've been working on. Thank you. And so this is a painting that I painted. And I'm not a painter, by the way. Like this is an experiment. So like if you are like a real artist, like no judgment here, all right? So I've just been experimenting with painting, mainly because it's a stress reliever for me, and it just kind of takes my mind in a different direction. I love art, and so I just thought, like maybe I would get into this. But what's very difficult for me to do? It's very difficult for me to throw away or walk away from any of my paintings. And sometimes I have a vision for them, and it just doesn't turn out well. Or the colors are not right, or what was in my mind just didn't translate onto the canvas. And so there are several pieces. This wouldn't be one of them, but there's several pieces where I have literally just started something new on what was already there. Because one, these are not cheap, so just throwing it away. I need to figure something else out. But the point is I created it. I have a vision for it. It's of value to me, and there's something that can be restored or made better, or I just believe deep down that there's a way. Can you take that from me? I just believe that deep down there's a way to restore it. So I'm constantly looking at how to make it better or how to do a makeover. And I believe that this is how God sees his creation. This is how God sees us, no matter how we see each other. Jesus is saying, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, because he wants us to see people the way he sees them. The term is called imago Dei, the image of God. And Pastor Reggie talked about this a few weeks ago. And that's the reason why I have this feeling that I have towards the things that I've created. The same feeling that God has about us as a creation. We're a reflection of him, no matter how broken we are, no matter how twisted, no matter how, and so God's transformation of our heart is to see others the way that he sees them, not based upon how they have responded to us. it's interesting that the message that Jesus was giving was deeply, deeply cultural. It was deeply cultural because it was very exclusionary, where those who were Jewish saw themselves as higher, and anyone outside of that, the Gentiles, were excluded and seen as enemies. And I think that's the case for us in the world that we live in today as well. And yes, Jesus is also talking about people who wrong us, that he's encompassing all of that, but he knows that there's this primary viewing of people who are just different. And many of us have enemies in our minds, people we don't know, people we never met, people who are associated with certain groups because they have certain ideologies, they have certain ways about them. We don't really know them, but we see them as enemy because we're like, yo, that stuff is jacked up. And maybe it is. But that's not really what Jesus is saying to us. He's saying, they're my creation too. And I love what my brother, Dr. David Anderson at Bridgeway Community Church outside of Baltimore says. He says, distance demonizes. And so then what Jesus does is these groups of people like tax collectors and lepers and even Samaritans, all of these people who would have been on the, hey, we don't hang with you list. Jesus then shows us he's hanging with them, he's touching them, he's having dinner with them. They're like, yo, how is it that this man is a man of God and he's hanging with the people on the do not hang with list? Because he understood that love leans in and hate creates distance and it demonizes. And so we're called to lean in. And Jesus did all this talking, did all of this walking for 3 years with his disciples, and he still didn't get it. And he understood that his assignment needed one final demonstration. And it was Jesus going to the cross. And even at the very end, just to remind you that the disciples didn't get it, like they came to arrest Jesus, and like Peter was like, yo, I'm about to cut your ear, and cut the man's ear off, like, yo, he's defending someone he loves. He sees him as an enemy, what does Jesus do? Jesus restores the man's ear. So right in that scene, we have a picture of what it means for us to love, and what the power of love is supposed to do is supposed to restore. Now, can you imagine this man's life and testimony moving forward, that his ear was once cut off, but it was restored by someone who was supposed to be an enemy? What would happen if we showed up in the world that way? What would happen if we leveraged God's power in that way? Jesus goes to the cross, and we know John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, and whoever would believe in him should not die, but live eternally because of Jesus' sacrifice. So what does that mean for us? For those who follow Jesus, who want to follow Jesus, who are considering following Jesus, it means that this is how we love our neighbors, how we love our enemies, our neighborhoods, how we show up in our city. This is the kind of transformational power that we must embody.